Hey everyone, today we are going to be learning about the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ended World War I. This lesson will take place in my class on February 23rd and February 24th. Today we will do the warm-up, our notes on the Treaty of Versailles, a SHAG activity, and then an exit ticket, which has to do with the following question: how can a war influence a nation's foreign policy? Please be thinking about this essential question as we go through our slides today. Our warm up for today is a political cartoon analysis, so that's why I don't have it on the slide. But the question on Canvas will be asking you, what predictions can you make about the Treaty of Versailles based on the primary sources in the political cartoons that are at hand on there? First, we're going to review some of the home front establishments that were created during World War I to help people within the United States support the war effort. First is the Committee on Public Administration, or CPI. This was created by Wilson to, quote, sell the war to Americans or convince them to support it. They recruited advertising executives, artists, authors, songwriters, entertainers, public speakers, and movie companies. This was an American propaganda machine. What types of messages might propaganda try to sell? We looked at a lot of propaganda in the previous lesson. Pause to think. We'd want to convince people to support the war effort by joining the military, by rationing food, gas, other essential items that might be needed for the military, convincing them to work hard and work in production industries, even women, because the men would typically be fighting in the military and need people to replace them. Part of the Treaty of Versailles was Wilson's 14 points. So these 14 points were delivered to the United States Congress in January of 1918. Wilson was trying to separate American involvement in World War I from European tensions and focus on moral reasons for joining the war. What were some moral reasons for joining World War I? Why might some people want to join World War I? To try to combat, pause if you don't know, try to combat militarism, dictatorship, some feelings of communism that were emerging, and try to limit those impacts. In your opinion, did the United States make the right decision in joining World War I? Why or why not? I'm not going to discuss this one here because I really want to hear your opinions, but just make sure that you are answering this why or why not and citing evidence as to why. Wilson's 14 points included no secret treaties, freedom of navigation on the seas, because remember, there were some huge problems with sinking U-boats, sinking boats that were trying to train. Free trade among nations goes along with that as well. Reduction of arms, that means reducing the power of the militaries of all countries involved. Adjust colonial claims based on needs of people being colonized and the governments colonizing. Now remember all of the lessons on imperialism. There will be some changes to imperialism during this time. Points 6 through 13 were recommendations concerning specific European countries and what punishments or new barriers they might have after World War I. And point 14 was a proposal to establish an association of nations to protect political interests and territory of all involved. This would be called the League of Nations. This is comparable to a certain organization in this time. What organization might that be? Pause to think. That's the United Nations that I'm asking you to draw on there. Here is a quick video on Wilson's 14 points.
The 14 points. On January 8th, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson delivered his famous 14-point speech, where he outlined a plan to end World War I and secure world peace. When the war broke out in 1914, Wilson adopted a policy of neutrality with no intention of involving the US in a foreign war. But the US couldn't remain isolated for long. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decoded a message known as the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany asked Mexico to ally with them against the United States. Then, on February 1st of the same year, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare and started sinking merchant and passenger ships with US citizens on board, something they had agreed not to do after sinking the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was torpedoed without warning, leading to the deaths of over 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. This was the final straw. On April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Just 2 days later, on April 4th, Congress declared war. The war was brutal and expensive. In a little under 2 years of fighting, the US had spent $32 billion and lost over 116,000 men. Wilson wanted the war to end, but when announcing his 14 points in January of 1918, Wilson didn't just want to end the war to protect America, he hoped to prevent wars from ever happening again. So together with his advisor and friend, Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson organized a group of 150 political and social scientists to study Allied and American policy all over the globe, collecting nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps. This would inform the idealistic 14 points, which would address causes of the World War and also propose solutions to ensure world peace in the future through policy and negotiations. 8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat and securing borders and statehood for Italy, Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized. But one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. When the Allies met in Versailles to create a treaty to end the war, they were less interested in Wilson's idealistic vision and more interested in regaining what they had lost and punishing Germany. To Wilson's disappointment, the points were barely integrated, and only to the benefit of the Allies. Most of them weren't actually adopted or honored by anyone after the treaty was signed. However, the 14th point was incorporated: the creation of a world organization providing collective security. This would later be known as the League of Nations. Ironically, despite a campaign from Wilson, the US never actually joined the League of Nations. Wilson foreshadowed that without American membership in the League, there would be another world war within a generation. Sure enough, World War II would break out just 20 years later.
Nice job there. Here are some political cartoons regarding the League of Nations. So, the League of Nations was meant to restrict the dog of war and is really an idealist philosophy that hopefully would restrict this dog of war. But some people doubted that and felt that it was in reality really fragile. That's why it's demonstrated as a bubble here. The United States Congress opposed Wilson's proposal for the United States to join the League of Nations. Why would they be fearful of that? We covered this a little bit in the warm up. They're hesitant to get involved in alliances with other countries because they just emerged from this world war and they don't want any chance of being pulled into something like that again. The big three involved in these negotiations after World War I, involved in creating the Treaty of Versailles, was France. The opposite of Wilson was Clemenceau from France, who was nicknamed the Tiger for his fierce war policy. Clemenceau wanted to crush the Germans so that they could never invade France again. Clemenceau felt that Wilson wanted to be too soft on Germany and said Wilson has 14 points, God Almighty has only 10. We also have Great Britain as part of the big three, with Lloyd George of Great Britain holding a middle position between Wilson and Clemenceau. While promising to make the Germans pay, Lloyd George knew that destroying Germany would not be good for Europe. Lloyd George helped work out many of the compromises in the treaty as the middle person. So far, why do you think that France and Britain were considered part of the big three? Pause. I'll insert this question on here so you can look at it as well. Because they had a lot of influence during World War One. They were some of the countries that contributed the most military power. They were some of the countries with the highest numbers of casualties due directly to that, how much they were involved. The goals of European nations were included that they wanted to punish Germany for the war. They wanted financial repayment of war. They wanted returns of lost land from the past and the present. And they wanted to weaken Germany's global influence by breaking up colonial holdings. They said that German people must pay for all damage to civilians on land or sea or from the air. Here we see an example of these peace discussions. Germany is on the edge of these peace discussions, about to be pushed into this pit of having to repay, having to return the land. And the Allied powers, so that's France, Britain, and the United States, are pushing Germany into that pool where they don't want to be due to the peace discussions. During Reconstruction, Northerners wanted to punish Southerners. Let's draw a comparison here. Why were they wanting to punish them? Pause to think. They felt that the Southerners were at fault for this war and had caused many, many deaths. So they wanted some kind of repayment for the damage, for the loss of life. And it's something, a similar concept here. England and France do not have the same views with regard to peace. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, this is a quote, so I'm not going to change the phrasing to be more clear because they talk differently in 1918. England and France have not the same views with regard to peace that we have by any means. When the war is over, we can force them to our views of thinking, because by that time they will, among other things, be financially in our hands. Wilson, 1918. What do you think that he meant by this last statement? He will be financially in our hands. The United States is trying to view France and Britain as indebted to the United States because the US stepped in and helped them with their war, with their battle, is how they're trying to phrase it here. And therefore, France and Britain will owe them or see them as a power that they should, hypothetically, respect. The Paris Peace Accords took place in January of 1919. 27 nations attended, and the Big Four had the most influence. That included Wilson of the US, Clemenceau from France, George from Great Britain, and Orlando from Italy. We kind of already talked about this, but why do these four have the most influence? Pause to remember. They were most directly involved with World War One the whole time. They had some of the most casualties, they had some of the most militaries involved, and were some of the first to be attacked in the perspective of those in Europe. Which country fought in World War II but was not a major player at the Treaty of Versailles? Why do you think that country was not involved? So look back here. We had the United States, France, Great Britain, Italy. What other countries were not involved but were involved in World War One? That would be Russia. Russia withdrew from World War One slightly early because they were dealing with their Bolshevik revolution. So therefore they were left out of the peace talks, unfortunately. Some of the major clauses in the Treaty of Versailles included creating 10 new nations to kind of divide the lines within Europe for to draw around those who had similar policies and agreements to hopefully prevent future wars. They returned land to France. Germany paid reparations of about, look at this giant bag of money. There's a ton of reparations. What are reparations? Basically, financial repayment for the damages that were done. Germany assumed war guilt, and the German military was banned from exceeding 100,000 troops. It also created the League of Nations. These are the countries of Europe in 1919. Here you see the 10 new countries labeled. We've got, for example, Finland, new boundaries for Poland and Czechoslovakia, Austria and Hungary created into two separate countries, the Republic of Turkey. So there are some changes going on here. Some of the major weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles include that Germany was humiliated by this interaction. Russia was left out of the talks and lost even more land than Germany lost. Italy's requests were basically ignored, and European colonies were upset over their treatment. Self determination of the Middle East was also ignored. Now, alliances might form out of this conflict. What kind of alliances might you predict? Pause to think. Perhaps Germany and Russia might be looking at each other saying, we got a little bit screwed over by this interaction, and we might be interested in working together in the future. Some of the punishments for Germany included this abbreviation that you can remember as BRAT. Germany had to accept the blame for starting the war in the form of a war guilt cause. Germany had to pay over $33 billion in reparations or fines. Germany was forbidden to have an army over 100,000 men, no submarines, no air force, and Germany lost territory in colonies to Britain and France. Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France. Land was lost to Poland, and Rhineland was to be occupied by Allied troops. These were all mostly territories that Germany took over throughout the war. How could some of these effects of World War I contribute to World War II? Take a moment to think. We've got the League of Nations forming. So this is going to be an automatic alliance. If any of these nations are attacked, the others would be inclined to pull into that attack as well. Remember that alliances were one of the major causes of World War I. The Constitution of the United States gives the Senate the power to ratify treaties, including the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson did not communicate well with the United States Senate while they were at the Paris Peace Conference. How do you think that Congress felt about that? Well, when Wilson came back, they were pretty hesitant to approve this treaty because they weren't involved in the making of it at all. It's not really Wilson's, while he was the delegate to go and sit on that representation, he should have known that the Senate was the one to sign this and involve them more in the process to make sure that they would be willing to approve of the treaty. But the US Senate never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. Their biggest issue was with the League of Nations. Recall, what was the League of Nations? It's this community of countries that would agree to help and support one another in another event of war. They didn't want to be in an alliance. Here is a cartoon that you will see again about the League of Nations. We have this bridge, says Belgium, France, England, Italy. The keystone is labeled as the United States. What does the cartoonist want you to believe? Pause to think. That without the United States, the bridge is largely ineffective. It's the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations is largely ineffective. Without the United States, the League does not have as much power support as it would with the United States, especially because the United States was building one of the largest militaries in the world. Here's another cartoon about this time period. We have Japan, England, France, Italy, and the United States all singing along to Everlasting Peace. But all of them, except the United States, have something in their back pocket, all of which are military weapons, guns that they might be using in the future. I can't make out the words exactly on here. If you can, feel free to leave a comment for me because it is just too blurry, unfortunately. And that's just the quality of the cartoon over time. But we see that while they're pretending to sing Everlasting Peace, we are already seeing hints that this will not exactly last. The United States economy following World War I, there was a brief slowdown right after the war because the economy had exploded during the war. But in 1921, there became a booming American economy. This is going to be super important. There were industry booms, like the automotive industry primarily. Consumer goods like radios and vacuums were produced at an all time high. And the stock market was the measuring stick of our economy and rose 400%. People began buying on margin, which stock prices climbed higher and higher. 30 nations were involved in the war, totaling 37.5 million casualties who were dead and wounded. 50% of those were due to disease and starvation. Just over half of all men didn't return home. The United States suffered 364,000 casualties, and 10 million refugees came out of World War I. What are refugees? Pause. Refugees are people who feel that it's not safe to live in their home country and are seeking asylum or safety in another country. They're similar to immigrants, but hopefully hoping to return home to their original country once the conflict has stopped. Most of the casualties were from Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Great Britain, followed by Italy, Turkey, and finally the United States. There were so many European ruins. There were Belgian refugees looking for a place to live. Europe was left in ruins. Russian soldiers and many soldiers from many countries, had passed away in battle, suffering terrible deaths. How do you think the Europeans felt at the end of World War I? We've talked a lot about the United States perspective, given this is an American history class, but how might the Europeans have felt? Pause to think. They likely feel extremely defeated by this conflict. They perhaps are hoping to form a more positive alliance with the United States, since the United States' entry helped them to prevent more casualties and end the war a bit sooner. There are multiple possible answers for that I didn't discuss. The war was extremely expensive for many, many countries, with the British Empire facing the largest amount of expenses, followed by Germany, and then followed by the United States, even though they were one of the last countries to enter the war and had the lowest number of troops from the main other countries fighting in the war. Now we're going to look at some primary source stations with this question in mind. Why did most senators oppose the United States joining the League of Nations? So you're going to go through all the stations and then write the paragraph at the end about that question. You're going to submit to this Treaty of Versailles stations activity. So you're going to rotate through. We do have some group roles here. You'll have an assigned group. For each station, you're going to read the information and then complete your guided notes. Then you will verbally discuss the discussion questions with your group. I have rotated the roles from last time that we did a group activity. Now there are about two, sometimes three, only one on one occasion there are 3 questions per station. So these will not take you too long, probably going to do about 7 minutes per rotation to start out. So we have the first name is the starter. This person is going to begin by sharing their thoughts for each discussion question and ask other students to build on that answer. The second name is the reader. You are going to read the station information and discussion questions aloud for your group. The third name is the tracker. You will ensure that everyone in the group contributes to the conversation. The fourth name is the note taker. On your own paper, you're going to take notes for the group to capture key information from your discussion. The fifth name is the presenter. Once you come together for a whole class discussion, this person is going to use the note taker's notes to answer the questions on behalf of the group. And the sixth name is the pacer. This person will watch the time to ensure that the group paces out the discussion appropriately in order to answer all the questions. Okay, so in this, it's not going to be on your own paper actually. You're going to do the note takers on the worksheet. You will take notes for the group to capture the key information for the discussion. You will not be the only person capturing the answers. Everyone should contribute because you are turning this in. And you all can turn in the same thing if you like. However, the note taker should not be the only one typing on here. And I can tell when the note taker is the only one typing. I just want the note taker to be in charge of making sure that you have captured everyone's opinion about the question and that note taker is reading over the answer, proofreading it, making sure that you agree that it is a good answer. All right, we have a lot to do today. We are also doing ACT Practice Test B, passages 2 and 3 for 17 minutes. You're going to focus on applying the strategies that we've learned to multiple passages. Once you finish that, we are going to do the exit ticket on Canvas. How can war influence a nation's foreign policy? That is your question for today. Thank you all so much for taking the time to learn about the Treaty of Versailles.